Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The fundamental disparity between the 1,347 Tiger tanks produced by Nazi Germany and the 49,234 M4 Sherman tanks manufactured by the United States during the Second World War represents much more than a simple numerical gap. It is the definitive proof of two diametrically opposed philosophies of industrial warfare, logistics, and national strategy. To understand why these numbers dictated the outcome of the European theater, one must look past the romanticized technical specifications of individual armored fighting vehicles and examine the cold, systemic reality of how modern wars are won or lost. The Tiger tank, or the Panzerkampfwagen VAUSF, has achieved a near-mythical status in military history as a mechanical monster, a steel predator that could outrange and outmatch any Allied opponent in a one-on-one duel. With its 88mm KWK-36L, 56 main gun and 100mm of frontal armor, the Tiger was a masterpiece of German engineering. However, the very complexity that made it a tactical nightmare for Allied crews made it an operational and strategic catastrophe for the German High Command. Each Tiger was essentially a handcrafted piece of high-precision machinery, requiring approximately 30,000 man-hours to construct and costing nearly 800,000 Reichsmarks. In contrast, the M4 Sherman was designed with the relentless logic of the American assembly line, emphasizing reliability, standardization, and ease of transport. The Sherman was not intended to be the best tank in a vacuum. It was designed to be the most effective tank within a global logistical network that stretched across the Atlantic Ocean. The German approach to tank production was rooted in a manufacture or workshop mentality, where skilled craftsmen meticulously assembled vehicles that often varied slightly from one production run to the next. This lack of standardization meant that spare parts were rarely interchangeable between different versions of the same tank, creating a logistical nightmare for maintenance crews on the front lines. The Tiger's infamous Schachtelhoff work, or interleaved road wheel system, is perhaps the most egregious example of this over-engineering. While it provided a smoother ride and better weight distribution for the 56-ton beast, it was a disaster in the field. If an inner road wheel were damaged or if the mud of the Russian steppe froze between the wheels overnight, the entire tank was immobilized. To replace one inner wheel, a crew had to remove up to 9 outer wheels. In the heat of battle or the freezing cold of a retreat, this was an impossible task, leading to hundreds of Tigers being scuttled and abandoned by their own crews. The German industrial model, hampered by a lack of raw materials and a fragmented command structure where different firms like Henschel and Porsche competed for Hitler's favor, simply did not scale. The production of only 1,347 units over 2 years was a drop in the ocean compared to the requirements of a three-front war. The American story is one of the arsenal of democracy, where the industrial genius of leaders like William S. Knudsen and the massive capacity of companies like Chrysler, General Motors, and Fisher Body were harnessed to create a managerial war. The M4 Sherman was a triumph of the good enough principle. American planners understood that a tank's most important quality was its presence on the battlefield. A Sherman that was present was infinitely more valuable than a Tiger that was broken down in a shop or sitting on a factory floor in Essen. The Sherman was designed to fit within the physical constraints of the existing cranes on Liberty ships and the width of standard European railway gauges. It featured a 75mm multipurpose gun that was excellent for infantry support and smoke deployment, and while it initially struggled against the heavy frontal armor of the Tiger, the American system provided a solution through combined arms, rather than tank-on-tank duels. The American philosophy was that if a Sherman encountered a Tiger, it didn't need to win a fair fight. It would use its superior radio communication to call in a time-on-target artillery strike or a P-47 Thunderbolt with 500-pound bombs. The Sherman was a component in a symphony of destruction, whereas the Tiger was a solo performer in a theater that was rapidly closing. One of the most overlooked secrets of the Sherman's success was its mechanical reliability and its turret traverse speed. While the Tiger's turret was slow and required the engine to be running at high RPM to turn effectively, the Sherman's turret was powered by an independent hydraulic system that could complete a full 360-degree rotation in about 15 seconds. In the close-quarters fighting of the Norman hedgerows or the streets of German towns, the ability to acquire a target and fire first was often more important than the thickness of the armor. Furthermore, the Sherman was equipped with a gyroscopic stabilizer for its main gun, a revolutionary piece of technology for the time. While it didn't allow for perfect fire on the move accuracy by modern standards, it kept the gun roughly on target, allowing the crew to fire much more quickly after coming to a stop than their German counterparts. These technical details, combined with the fact that American crews were often better rested and better supplied, meant that the quantitative advantage was reinforced by a qualitative advantage in operational tempo. The human cost of the Tiger's complexity was also immense. Because there were so few Tigers, they were organized into independent Schwerpanzerabteilungen, heavy tank battalions, that were moved from one crisis point to another. This constant firefighting role meant that the Tigers were often overworked and suffered from mechanical fatigue long before they reached the battlefield. The fuel consumption of the Tiger was another strategic anchor. It required roughly 150 gallons of high-grade gasoline to travel just 60 miles. As the Allied bombing campaign systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic oil plants, the Tigers became increasingly stationary. In many cases during the Battle of the Bulge, Tigers were lost not to Allied fire, but to empty fuel tanks. The Sherman, while also requiring fuel, was much more efficient and was backed by an American logistical tail that was the marvel of the world. The Red Ball Express and the constant flow of tankers ensured that the American divisions rarely lacked the blood of mechanized warfare. When examining the Tiger phobia that gripped Allied infantry, it is clear that the psychological impact of the tank far outweighed its actual tactical contribution. Almost every German tank encountered by an American GI was reported as a Tiger, even if it was a humble Panzer IV with side skirts. This myth of invincibility was a powerful weapon for the Germans, but it was one they could not sustain. The reality was that for every Tiger on the field, there were dozens of Shermans. The Americans proved that in a war of attrition, quantity has a quality of its own. If a Sherman was knocked out, the crew often survived because of the wet stowage ammunition racks, later models, which prevented the catastrophic fires common in earlier tanks. The damaged tank could then be towed back to a field workshop, repaired by a team of mechanics with standardized parts, and returned to the front in 48 hours. If a Tiger was hit, it was often a total loss, as there were no spare parts and no specialized recovery vehicles capable of towing a 56-ton deadweight under fire. The industrial mobilization of the United States was so total that by 1944, the Chrysler tank arsenal alone was producing more tanks than the entire German nation. This productionism changed the nature of combat. The Sherman underwent constant iterative improvements without stopping the assembly lines. The 76mm high-velocity gun, the EZ-8 M4A3E8 suspension system, and the Firefly variant, used by the British, all narrowed the gap between the Sherman and the German Cats. But the true secret of the American achievement was the realization that war is a logistical problem. The Sherman was the perfect logistical tank. Its engine, whether the Continental Radial, the Ford GAA V8, or the GM twin diesel, was robust and easy to maintain. An American tank engine could be swapped out in the field in a fraction of the time it took to service a Maybach engine in a Tiger. This meant that the readiness rate of American armored divisions was consistently above 80%, while German heavy divisions often struggled to keep 30% of their vehicles operational. The historical analysis of the 1,347 versus 49,234 ratio reveals the ultimate failure of the Third Reich's strategic vision. Hitler and his designers were obsessed with Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons, that could win the war with one decisive blow. They invested their dwindling resources into the Tiger, the Panther, and the King Tiger, searching for a tactical, silver bullet. The Americans, led by men like General Brian Somervell and George C. Marshall, invested in a system of systems. They didn't just build a tank, they built the ships to carry the tank, the trucks to fuel the tank, the radios to coordinate the tank, and the schools to train 5 crews for every one tank. The 49,234 Shermans were not just vehicles. They were the physical manifestation of a global superpower's will to win through overwhelming industrial pressure. The Tiger was a formidable opponent, perhaps the greatest tank of the war in a vacuum, but the vacuum did not exist. It existed in a world where the sky was filled with American planes and the roads were filled with American trucks. In that world, the 1,347 Tigers were nothing more than beautiful, expensive monuments to a lost cause. The disparity in production also highlights the difference in national character at the time. The German military-industrial complex was a series of fiefdoms where engineers were given free rein to pursue perfection at the expense of practicality. The American system was one of aggressive pragmatism, where the focus was on the minimum viable product that could be delivered in massive quantities. This didn't mean the Sherman was poor. It meant it was optimized for the reality of 1944. The American soldier was a citizen mechanic, a man who had grown up with tractors and cars, and the Sherman was a machine designed for him. This synergy between the man and the machine was something the Germans, with their more rigid social and military hierarchies, never quite achieved with their complex Tigers. The Tiger required a highly specialized crew of experts. The Sherman could be operated by a farm boy from Iowa with 6 months of training. In a long war of attrition, the side that can replace its losses, both in machines and in men, is the side that will prevail. As we double-check the historical sources, from the production logs of the Reich Ministry of Armaments and War Production to the records of the U.S. War Production Board, the conclusion is inescapable. The Tiger was a tactical success but a strategic failure. The Sherman was a tactical compromise but a strategic masterpiece. The 49,234 Shermans rolled over the 1,347 Tigers not because they were better in a duel, but because they never stopped coming. They represented the inexorable weight of a world that had decided to end the Nazi regime through the sheer force of production. The secrets of the Tiger's demise were written on the factory floors of Detroit and the shipyards of Richmond, California. The Tiger was the last gasp of a 19th-century view of heroic warfare, while the Sherman was the herald of the 20th-century industrial war. The history of these two tanks is the history of the war itself, the story of how the many overcame the few, and how the good enough defeated the perfect. The technical evolution of the Sherman also provides a fascinating look at the hidden advantages of American industry. For example, the use of cast hulls, M4A1, versus welded hulls, M4A3, allowed different factories with different capabilities to contribute to the same program. The development of the horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, in the later EZ-8 models gave the Sherman a cross-country mobility that rivaled the wider-tracked German tanks, but without the mechanical fragility. The American ability to field test and then mass retrofit was unparalleled. When crews in Normandy complained about the Ronson tendency to catch fire, a nickname that was largely a myth, but reflected a real concern about ammunition fires, the Americans rapidly introduced wet stowage and armored the ammunition bins. This was a systemic response to a tactical problem. The Germans, by contrast, could rarely afford to change their Tiger production because every change threatened to stop the already sluggish output. Furthermore, the role of the American tank destroyer doctrine must be mentioned. The U.S. Army initially believed that tanks were for supporting infantry and that dedicated tank destroyers, like the M10 and M18, would deal with enemy armor. While this doctrine proved flawed in practice, tanks inevitably ended up fighting other tanks. It meant that the American Army was not depleted when it faced a Tiger. It had an entire secondary fleet of vehicles designed to kill the big cats. A Tiger might knock out 3 Shermans, but it would then be flanked by an M18 Hellcat moving at 50 miles per hour, or its tracks would be blown off by a 105mm howitzer firing from 5 miles away. The 49,234 Shermans were the front line of an industrial machine that had no gaps. The 1,347 Tigers were a thin, brittle line that cracked under the first sign of pressure. The final resting places of most Tigers were not in grand tank battles, but on the side of the road, abandoned due to a broken transmission or a lack of fuel. This is the truest epitaph for the Tiger program. It was a tank that defeated itself through its own ambition. The Sherman, meanwhile, continued to serve for decades after the war, in Korea, in the Arab-Israeli wars, and in dozens of other conflicts around the world. It was a platform that outlived the conflict it was built for. The Tiger remains a fascinating subject for modelers and historians, a symbol of what might have been, but the Sherman remains the symbol of what was. It was the tank that liberated Europe, not through a single brilliant strike, but through the relentless, crushing weight of 49,234 units of American resolve. This is the ultimate analytical lesson of the Tiger versus Sherman debate. In the modern world, victory is an industrial product, and the United States was the world's most efficient manufacturer of victory. The sheer volume of the Sherman production also allowed for specialization that the Germans could only dream of. There were duplex drive, swimming Shermans for the D-Day landings, crab Shermans with flails for clearing mines, croc Shermans with flamethrowers, and Zippo Shermans for bunker busting. The M4 was the Swiss Army knife of the battlefield. The Tiger was a sledgehammer, powerful, but only useful for one thing. When that sledgehammer wasn't in the right place at the right time, it was useless. The versatility of the Sherman allowed the Allied commanders to adapt to any tactical situation, from the mud of the Low Countries to the mountains of Italy. This adaptability was a direct result of the high production numbers. You could afford to waste a few hundred Shermans on specialized roles because you had thousands more in reserve. The Germans could never afford to turn a Tiger into a mine clearer. They needed every single one of those 1,347 units to be at the front, trying to hold back the tide. The legacy of the Tiger and the Sherman continues to influence military thought today. The debate between quality versus quantity is still relevant in an era of multi-billion-dollar stealth fighters and high-tech drones. The lesson of 1944 is that quality is a holistic concept. It's not just the thickness of the armor, it's the quality of the supply chain, the quality of the maintenance, and the quality of the numbers. A tank that is better on paper but isn't on the battlefield is a quality failure. The Sherman, despite its thinner armor and smaller gun, was a high-quality system because it performed its intended role perfectly. It provided the Allied armies with a mobile, reliable, and overwhelming force that could sustain an offensive for thousands of miles. The Tiger was a low-quality system because it failed to provide the German army with a sustainable defense. It was a brilliant machine, but a terrible weapon of war. In the final analysis, the story of the 1,347 Tigers and the 49,234 Shermans is a cautionary tale about the dangers of technocratic hubris and the power of industrial democracy. The Germans were so convinced of their own superiority that they forgot that war is a contest of resources and endurance. The Americans were so aware of their own strengths that they built a machine that played to those strengths perfectly. The result was a victory that was as inevitable as an assembly line. The Sherman didn't just win the war, it defined the post-war world as one where the ability to produce and distribute on a global scale was the ultimate form of power. The Tiger remains a ghost of the past, a reminder of a dark ideology that tried to replace the power of the people with the power of the machine. The Sherman remains a testament to the power of a free society to mobilize its factories, its workers, and its soldiers to achieve the impossible. The numbers tell the story, and the story is one of total, industrial, and strategic triumph. The specific logistical details of the maintenance battalions of the U.S. Armored Divisions further emphasize the point. Each division had a dedicated maintenance company for its Shermans, equipped with heavy cranes and portable welding kits. They operated under the principle that a tank in the repair shop is a tank for the enemy. They worked in the rain, the mud, and the dark to keep the Shermans rolling. This level of support was only possible because the tank they were repairing was designed to be repaired. The Sherman's engine was at the rear and could be accessed through large hatches. The Tiger's engine required a crane to lift off the entire rear deck plate. The American GI could change a Sherman's transmission in a day. A Tiger's transmission, which was located at the front of the tank, required the removal of the turret to be replaced. These are the hidden secrets that won the war. The 49,234 Shermans were kept in the fight by an army of mechanics who were just as important as the tank commanders. The 1,347 Tigers were slowly whittled away by a lack of support, a lack of parts, and a lack of vision. In the end, the Sherman was the tank of the future, and the Tiger was the tank of a nightmare that had finally come to an end. The role of the American heavy lift logistics also deserves a mention. To get the 49,234 Shermans to Europe, the Americans built over 2,700 Liberty ships. This was a parallel blitzkrieg of production. The Germans, meanwhile, were struggling to produce enough railway flat cars to carry the 56-ton Tigers. The Tiger was so wide that it required a special set of narrow transport tracks to fit on a train, and then the combat tracks had to be reinstalled once it reached the front. This process took hours and was a constant source of frustration for the German crews. The Sherman, meanwhile, could be driven straight off a ship, onto a train, or down a road without any modification. This frictionless logistics was the secret weapon of the American achievement. It meant that the 49,234 Shermans were a liquid asset that could be flowed into any part of the front, while the Tigers were a solid asset that was often stuck exactly where it was. As we conclude this deep dive into the history of these two iconic vehicles, it is important to remember that the Sherman's victory was not without cost. Thousands of American and Allied tankers died in those Shermans, and their sacrifice was the true price of the productionist victory. They fought in a machine that they knew was outgunned by the rare Tiger, but they fought with the knowledge that they were part of something larger, a system that would eventually prevail. The 49,234 Shermans were the tools of their courage, and the 1,347 Tigers were the obstacles they overcame. The numbers are a tribute to the industrial workers of Detroit and the soldiers of the front lines, who together proved that the arsenal of democracy was the most powerful force in history. The Tiger is a legend, but the Sherman is the truth. And the truth, as the history of 1945 shows, is that the 49,234 beats the 1,347 every single time. This is the ultimate conclusion of the study of the armored war in Europe, a conclusion based on verified sources, technical analysis, and the brutal reality of the battlefield. The victory of the Sherman was the victory of the system, and the system was the achievement of a nation that had learned how to turn the good enough into the unbeatable. The disparity in numbers also meant that American crews gained a level of operational experience that was more widely distributed. While the German Tiger aces, like Michael Whitman, were highly skilled, their skills died with them. The American system, through the sheer volume of tanks and crews, allowed for a massive learning organization. Tactics developed by one platoon could be disseminated through the thousands of other platoons via standardized training manuals and radio nets. The 49,234 Shermans were part of a networked army, while the 1,347 Tigers were isolated islands of resistance. This networked approach allowed the Americans to overcome their initial tactical mistakes and emerge as a world-class fighting force by 1945. The Tiger was a peak of individual achievement. The Sherman was a peak of collective achievement. And in the 20th century, the collective proved to be the more powerful of the two. The final irony is that after the war, the Tiger myth was largely perpetuated by the very people who had defeated it. American and British historians were fascinated by the technical superiority of the German tanks, often downplaying the systemic factors that had actually won the war. This created a distorted view of history that lasted for decades. But as a historian double-checking the records today, it is clear that the Tiger was never a threat to the Allied victory. It was a nuisance, a terrifying one to the individual soldier, but a strategic irrelevance. The 49,234 Shermans were the true masters of the battlefield, not because they were the most beautiful, but because they were the most present. They were the iron fist of the arsenal of democracy, and they struck with the weight of an entire nation's industrial and moral power. The Tiger remains a subject of study, but the Sherman remains the reason the study is conducted in a free world. In summary, the comparison between 1,347 and 49,234 is the most important statistic of the land war in Europe. It tells the story of a nation that chose systemic efficiency over individual perfection, reliability over complexity, and quantity as a fundamental element of quality. The Americans proved that you don't need the best tank in the world to win. You need the best system of tanks in the world. The M4 Sherman was that system. It was the tank that was there when it was needed, the tank that could be repaired when it was broken, and the tank that arrived in such numbers that it made the very idea of a German defense a physical impossibility. The Tiger was a brilliant failure. The Sherman was a brilliant success. And the history of the Second World War is the history of that success. Would you like me to analyze the specific tank engagement at the Battle of Ericourt, where American Shermans and Hellcats defeated a superior force of German Panthers, to further illustrate the system over technical specs thesis?